Hello and welcome to a new episode of the ECMI Conversations with Experts series. My name is Ljubica Djordjevic and I'm a senior researcher at the ECMI, and I have the privilege of hosting Robin Wilson in today's talk. Dr. Robin Wilson is a long-term time consultant to the Council of Europe on intercultural integration. He is the author of the book Meeting the Challenge of Cultural Diversity in Europe, Moving Beyond the Crisis, in which he summarized his extensive experience in working on intercultural integration. With Robin, I want to discuss the Intercultural Cities Programme of the Council of Europe and explore how the programme's experiences can be applied to foster intercultural dialogue, both between majorities and national minorities and among national minorities themselves. So specifically, I'm interested in how the program could be implemented in national minority context. As you know, ECMI is focused on traditional national minorities and not so into migrant communities. But the Intercultural Cities Programme is very attractive also for this group, not only for migrants, I would say. So to set the framework for our conversation, I want to highlight 2 points. And I will give the word then to Robert, to you. So at the moment, ECMI is implementing a project in Serbia, a project titled Minority Protection for EU Accession. And one of the activities involves strengthening local councils for interethnic relations. These councils are local bodies in ethnically mixed municipalities aimed at protecting and fostering ethnic equality and positive interethnic relations. Unfortunately, they are not particularly functional. Similar experience can be observed in the region as well in the Czech Republic, but these councils are not by any means flagship institutions. When examining intercultural cities map, it is striking that few cities in Central and Eastern Europe participate in the program. While the program is predominantly migrant-oriented, it could be also adapted to foster dialogue with national minorities, and perhaps its scope could be also extended more to Eastern Europe. So as a start and as a welcome first, Robin, I'm really honored to have you here today. Could you please say a few words about the Intercultural Cities Programme of the Council of Europe, and maybe explain, you can also say a few more words about you if I missed something, and generally about this program. Please.
Thank you, Ljubica. It's a privilege to talk to you. The Intercultural Cities Programme was established in 2007 by the Council of Europe with the support at the time of the European Union. And the idea behind it was that it would trial on the ground the intercultural paradigm for the management of cultural diversity, which had been developed by the Council of Europe during this century. The Council of Europe, which is often confused with the European Union, was established in 1949 to say never again to aggressive nationalism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of intolerance through promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law as universal norms. So it felled the organization to address such worrying global phenomena as the events of September 11 in 2001 in the US and the wars of the Yugoslav succession. Out of this came the intercultural paradigm, responding to the failures of the two 20th century models to manage cultural diversity, the first of which you could describe as French-style assimilationism, and the second of which was multiculturalism as practiced on the back of their colonial experiences by the UK and the Netherlands. The new intercultural paradigm was first set out in the Council of Europe white paper on intercultural dialogue in 2008. A simple way to think about what is at stake here is to ask how each of these models conceives of the relationship of the dominant majority self to the minority other. Taking assimilationism first, in that approach, the other must come to be the same as the self, and hence the alienation and the riots against the police by Maghrebin youth, which were experienced in the Banlieue in France in 2005, and again more recently. Secondly, as to multiculturalism, in this approach, the self and the other lead separate lives. So there's ghettoization of minorities and mutual incomprehension. And this leads to the kind of intercommunal riots which took place between young people in England, in Northern England, in 2001. Interculturalism then is different. In this paradigm, the other is incorporated within the self and vice versa. And so intercultural integration becomes an enriching two-way process, as reflected in the title of the white paper on intercultural dialogue, which was Living Together as Equals in Dignity. The success of this model is indicated by how the Intercultural Cities Programme has expanded and indeed gone global. 164 cities around the world are now members directly or indirectly of the network. In 2015, the then 47 member states of the Council of Europe endorsed its achievements, and in 2022, when they were reduced by one by the removal of Russia, they backed a model framework for intercultural integration plans at the national level, building on the ICC's, the Intercultural Cities experience. And all this at a time, of course, when in what the German sociologist Ulrich Beck described as a world of really existing cosmopolitanization, many have clung to what Beck called constructed certitudes as offered by the far-right populists. So that's the overall background on the ICC's program, Ljubica.
Thank you. Maybe just a few, how does it work and on the program itself? And additionally, it targets mainly immigrant populations. What lessons have been learned, or what are possibilities for applying the program or some of its elements to national minorities? And also, as I mentioned in introduction, when you see the map, and it's really very extensive, it's mainly so Western and a bit of South Europe, but in Eastern Europe, from this region, I know that only Rijeka in Croatia is part of it, city also in Hungary, one or two cities, in Poland, one or two, and in Ukraine, but you can really list them on one hand. So the question is, what are the lessons and how can we maybe implement some of the elements also to national minority context? And additional does cities really mean big cities, or can it be implemented in smaller towns?
Because to take your first and last questions quickly before I get on to the main point you want to get to, as regards to how it works very effectively as a network for the sharing of good practice. And I evaluated the Intercultural Cities Programme for the director of it 5 years after it was established. And that was the big lesson that came across, that the benefit that member cities found they got out of it was primarily they were able to learn from their peers elsewhere in Europe and beyond as to what were good practices in dealing with cultural diversity. On your second point, yes, there's a wide range of variation in size, from cities which are only a few tens of thousands to those which have more than 500,000 inhabitants. And it seems to work very well regardless of scale. But let me come to your main point, which is about the geography of this. I'm from Northern Ireland, which, though it's on the northwestern tip of Europe, often feels like it belongs in the east, with its historic ethno-nationalist conflict. So I'm very sensitive to the fact that the challenge posed by cultural diversity in Europe can very schematically be distinguished as, in the West, primarily concerning issues arising from post-war migration, but in the centre and the East, primarily associated with autochthonous minorities. And yes, there is a skewing of membership of the Intercultural Cities Programme, as you've identified, towards the West. But the initial focus of the Council of Europe's exploratory work in this area was on ethnically divided cities and the former Yugoslavia, and I have made a special effort as an advisor to engage on the ground with Central and Eastern European members in Hungary, Serbia, and especially in Ukraine. The value of the intercultural paradigm in this context is it does work equally well when applied to issues of migrant and minority integration. And this is because at the heart of it is what the Italian political scientist Norberto Bobbio called the individualistic concept of society. Bobbio pointed out that the individual citizen is the unit of every democratic constitution, and we know all too well from Bosnia-Herzegovina since the Dayton Accords and Northern Ireland since the Belfast Agreement, my PhD, as it happens, took in both, that if instead constitutional arrangements are founded on purported communities with mutual political vetoes, then ethnic polarization is sustained and governance is dysfunctional. So, for instance, the Bosnian state has simply refused to implement the 2009 verdict by the European Court of Human Rights, part of the Council of Europe, of course, vindicating the claim by a Jewish and a Roma individual that they could not be represented in the House of Peoples in Bosnia or the collective presidency, consisting only of Serbs, Croats, and so-called Bosniaks. This insight was already reflected in the Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities in 1995, where the reference was not to communities as such, but to, quote, persons belonging to, unquote, as the rights holders, with a refusal to be deemed to belong to a minority community itself to be no disadvantage. And of course, any rights claim can only have an individual bearer. So this phraseology is also found in the Council of Europe Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, and indeed in the title of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious and Linguistic Minorities. In fact, this recognition goes back even further, and actually to a migration context. In the early 20th century, the Austro-Marxist social democratic figures Karl Renner and Otto Bauer developed what they called the personality principle to promote working class solidarity in a Vienna strongly marked by Czech migration. This would have allowed individuals of migrant origin to define themselves as of their nationality of origin on maturity or not, as they so wished. That principle was reflected in the German citizenship reform of 2000, again with migration, especially the children of Turkish Gastarbeiter, in mind. So, whereas the assimilationist model is willfully blind to cultural diversity, and multiculturalism hypostasizes collectivized communities to which only a stereotyped label can be applied, the intercultural paradigm's foundation in the equal human dignity of every individual means it can be applied to all manifestations of cultural diversity, including, of course, issues arising in relation to Roma, East and West in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. Although also minorities tend to emphasize this distinguishedness between migrants and national minorities, meaning that they shouldn't be put in the same basket with those newcomers, that they are autochthonous, and that integration models should be different. Nevertheless, some of the elements of integration can be used, or some other elements of integration can be developed for, especially for national minorities, because there are issues of integration also in the understanding of Ljubljana guidelines from the OSCE, where integration is not integrating the minority group into the bigger society as a two-way street or two-way process. And in that sense, it could be some of the instruments of the Intercultural Cities Program can indeed be used for integration, but although maybe integration is not the perfect term, because these are really autochthonous long-staying people in the countries, but for enhanced participation and dialogue between majority community and minority communities. Maybe we can talk a bit more about concrete measures and actions which cities perform under the Intercultural Cities Program, and this with the background of these councils, which I mentioned from the very beginning, because sometimes these bodies don't know what they need to do. And I assume that also in these cities you covered with the program, not all have from the very beginning understood the very concept of intercultural dimension. So what does it mean, and how cities live this intercultural program, and what are the good examples of activities in the normalized multi-ethnic or interethnic context, and how cities can contribute with which concrete actions to this intercultural identity of the city, but also the interaction between different communities. So concrete, what does it mean?
Well, I think it might be worth reflecting on a visit I had to Subotica in Serbia in 2011. At that stage, in Serbia, a law had recently been passed establishing national community councils. And I remember being very firmly told by the main leader of the voluntary sector in Subotica that this had in her view, a very damaging unintended effect. 4 of these national minority councils for the Hungarians, Croats, Bunjevci, and Germans were housed in Subotica, she told me. And this stimulated, she said, a tendency towards a more ethnic and less civic mindset among these actors. It encouraged community leaders to present themselves as exercising a monopoly in that role, tending to marginalize other intra-communal voices and those who would have identified themselves as others, such as Yugoslavs, rather than as persons belonging to particular communities. And alongside a loss of interest among most external funders as the wars of the Yugoslav succession receded into history, she said, this favoured a reduction in interethnic non-governmental organisations. And I think one of the difficulties with the interethnic councils against that background is that it is bringing together around the same table people who already tend to have very ethnicized, essentialized mindsets, which doesn't make it very easy to have a very fertile dialogue. What has, by contrast, emerged in various intercultural cities member cities as good practice, say in Bilbao or in Limassol, is a roundtable arrangement through which representatives of the municipality engage in an iterative dialogue with the full spectrum of NGOs arising from the particular mix of diversity in the city concerned: migrants, refugees, Roma, members of autochthonous minorities, and so on. Ideally, such a body is chaired by a senior elected figure with a specialist interest to indicate political commitment. It is central to the preparation, implementation, and revision of an overarching intercultural strategy for the city, and it establishes subcommittees and working groups as required, meeting between plenaries to find practical solutions to concrete dilemmas. Indeed, this is exactly how normality, to use that word, works. Matters which, if unaddressed, can acquire an emotional charge and become the focus of identity politics, say the influx of a large number of minority children into a particular school because of poorly managed immigration, are instead treated as problems to solve on a basis of the agreed strategy. And I think that model of these integration councils or integration committees that has been developed in a number of intercultural cities is a good one to follow. It's more flexible and more tied to the concrete situation and doesn't simply aggregate people into groups which they may or may not feel they want to be defined in terms of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good example, because here we have formalized bodies, but with no much effect. Because, and also what is, I think, striking, there is no overarching strategy. So they are left an institutional setup, but they don't know what to do. But let's not so focus on Serbia and intercultural councils, but what are so practical maybe examples of what can be done in the intercultural context? What, for example, you mentioned Bilbao. So is it education or some programs, youth programs, or other activities through which they foster intercultural dialogue in the local community? Can you name a few of such practical activities which these bodies or other bodies or institutions do to foster intercultural identity of a city?
Well, I said, Ljubica, how the strongest aspect of the Intercultural Cities Programme, the main reason cities have joined it, has been to share good practice. And that's now developed to such an extent that there is a huge database of good practices, which is on the Intercultural Cities section of the Council of Europe website. And it can be searched in terms of education, say, or any other theme to find where good practices exist in that area. In education, just with one example, one of the issues that arises in many cases with education is children in class having a range of different languages as their mother tongues, and how best to deal with that. In Reykjavik, for example, they've turned that into more of a positive rather than seeing it as a threat, and try to encourage in the schools what they call an effective multilingualism. Not that everybody speaks 5 languages, but the people can find ways to get along, and whether those be the children, whether the teachers, or indeed the parents. And of course, in this context and with many other intercultural projects around schooling, involvement of parents, particularly of women who might not otherwise be heavily involved in intercultural work and may be sidelined by the men, is very, very important. Um, uh, Integration in education is obviously hugely important, and in that context, clearly in Bosnia, the two schools under one roof arrangement is very problematic, and it's essential that children go to an integrated school and are encouraged to become adult citizens who can have a civic approach to the world and can understand their relationship to their fellow members of the society in which they live as being one of tolerance and mutual respect. Um, uh, I could equally talk about neighborhood planning. For example, in Barcelona,
Mm-hmm.
they integrate the neighborhood plan with the intercultural plan, and they realize that for this all to make sense on the street, it's got to operate at neighborhood level. And once you get into the fine grain of the neighborhood, then you need to know exactly what types of people are living in that neighborhood, and to address the issues and concerns that arise specifically in that context. So the governance of this kind of stuff has to be very bottom up. It can't be something that's done very much from the top down. And again, maybe a problem with the interethnic councils is a more formal top-down approach. It is very important. This is kind of learning by doing. It's participatory. It's practical problem solving, and so on in terms of the approach that's adopted. So whichever area you turn to, um, and there are many more we could discuss if we had time, you'll
Mm-hmm.
find that there is a lot of good practice that has been built up over the years. Obviously, you can't simply transplant from one place to another because the context will differ, but certainly people can learn a lot from good practices in other member cities and have done so to good effect.
And maybe summarizing this, it's really interesting to me. What are the main areas in which cities implement this intercultural? What are the main focus when we talk about areas about this interculturalism?
Well, again, it depends on the city, Ljubica, because it has to be specific. I've done work with a number of members of the Intercultural Cities Programme over the years, helping them with their intercultural strategies. And um, when I've tried to draft an intercultural strategy for them after talking to a lot of people in the city concerned, I've always started from a clean sheet of paper. And I've not done what some expensive consultant might go in and do from some consultancy firm and just cut and paste from something else they did before. Um, I've always realized that each city is unique and has to have a unique intercultural strategy that is tailor-made and bespoke for the needs that it has. But just to take another example randomly, a very successful member of the city, the Intercultural Cities Programme, is Oslo. And Oslo has been in recent decades the fastest growing city in Europe because of migrants and refugees who have come there. One of the interesting things about Oslo is that it's obviously economically very highly performing, as well, very prosperous. And they realize that they're competing for high-grade specialist workers whose labor market is the world, who can go anywhere. And they therefore realize that they've got to make the quality of life for them in Oslo so attractive, including in having a very tolerant environment, that they will want to come there. And so they have, interestingly, in Oslo, they have handled the intercultural issues within the same department that deals with business. And they see the two as interconnected, that it's good for business to have a diverse workforce. And indeed, they have copied Copenhagen, another member of the Intercultural Cities Programme, in developing a charter of diversity, which they have invited local businesses to sign to get businesses to embrace this idea of the diversity advantage. So in whichever area you go, whether it's health or it's social care or it's life in neighborhoods or it's business, wherever you look, there is some good practice in different cities to draw on, and may well be that the focus in one particular city will be on one of those rather than another.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And also it's applicable to national minority context, because these standards, for example, like taking into consideration that minorities tend to live in distant or border regions, that infrastructure can be built there stronger, or also employment possibilities to make them also attractive for people to stay, because it's also an issue for national minority people that they tend to immigrate from these areas if they are not sufficiently economically developed. This is something what advisory committee also stresses, that minority issues are not only education and language and so, but also this kind of socioeconomic participation. So these are some of the examples which can be useful also for a national minority context.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's obviously, when I've been dealing with authorities across Europe where there's a significant Roma group in the municipality area, I've always stressed that social inclusion aspect as well as the aspect of cultural integration. And one of the benefits of the intercultural approach, because it is about this idea of incorporating the other within the self, it does actually inherently imply a socially inclusive approach, as well as one that is tolerant and respectful.
Yeah, and one of the important takeaways for me, and also for Serbian context, is this need to make a local intercultural strategies, because cities, at least in but also in North Serbia, but I would say also in many parts of Europe, don't have developed strategies for ethnic mainstreaming and considering interethnic relations.
Sure.
And they just implement some of the legal frameworks, but this is not much consideration bottom up about how to manage diversity and how to do ethnic mainstreaming. So in that sense, I also find this Intercultural Cities program inspiring also for cities with minorities to think over and to consider from the bottom up perspective how this interethnic composition of the city can be maximized to the better living in a local community.
Sure. Yeah, and of course, the very process of producing an intercultural strategy, if it's done in a properly bespoke and bottom-up way, gives people a sense, if they are from national minorities, particularly if they feel they may not have been taken very seriously in the past, it gives them a sense of being recognized as legitimate civic actors in their own right, who have a voice which is being listened to. And that, apart from the substance of what goes into an intercultural strategy, that very process of preparing it can be valuable in terms of making people feel that they're included.
Thanks. And a final question, which is partly not so positive, but I hope it can have positive outcome with the help of your program. It is divided cities. The question of divided cities, and unfortunately in the Balkans we still have a few of divided cities. In some parts of Europe there are new one created now due to the conflict, and in some, at least when we have peace, these cities are coexist, so ethnic groups coexist maybe peacefully but remain segregated. And is the Intercultural Cities Program also helpful in this context and can help to create connections and gradually reduce these divisions? What is your experience, also coming from Belfast, also from one context which is in the history has been in this division? So how can we mitigate or use the instruments of this program for these extremes, let's say?
Well, another strength of the intercultural paradigm is that it places an emphasis on civil society organizations, whereas the assimilationist model considers only the state and the multiculturalist alternative at best foregrounds only a very small number of associations, often dominated by older men and or the religious, each deemed to represent a particular monolithic community. In the latter case, the multiculturalist case, social segregation is compounded if, as I said, education is organised, as in Bosnia or indeed Northern Ireland, along ethno-religious lines, allowing communalist narratives of recent history to be reproduced in the next generation. Again, because interculturalism recognizes, as the social thinker Zygmunt Bauman put it, not a variety of cultures, but cultural variety, it envisages a pluralist spectrum of identity in which each individual has a complex and evolving identity which is unique to them, rather than society being bifurcated into ethnic camps. As a result, not only will ICC Intercultural Cities members often have roundtable integration councils or committees, as I said, but they will also often allocate funds to intercultural organisations doing good work to promote dialogue on the ground. I remember being hugely impressed at a meeting in the framework of the Intercultural Cities Programme in Turin 5 years ago. The meeting was tackling hate speech and discrimination, and there I met two women, one Arab, one Jewish, instrumental in the work of the Arab Jewish Cultural Center in the Israeli member city of Haifa. Such support for civic society organizations might include using sports such as football, which is a personal obsession of mine, to engender tolerance via multi-ethnic tournaments, for example. Public space also matters, as I said. In Barcelona, which I mentioned, they have this notion of the street becoming a space of relations. through planning being intercultural. Public institutions such as museums and libraries can also do much to promote a public sphere which is dialogic and networked through events such as the human library idea, through which a variety of participants exchange their life stories, so individualizing and rehumanizing the other. And schools are obviously fundamental. As I said, not only must these be integrated, but they must educate the youth to achieve a civic maturity in which they can decenter themselves from any communal affiliation and think reflexively as a reasonable citizen. Attending a Protestant secondary school in Northern Ireland as the violence erupted, I struggled with very limited available resources to make sense of what was going on. Political leadership is critical. A former mayor of Tuzla told an early Council of Europe event in the framework of its intercultural work how the whole municipal leadership in the Bosnian city had ensured it would remain a haven of peace by going out and knocking on doors together to reassure the public. The incentives created by the structures of governance, however, matter hugely, and that's where organisations such as the European Centre for Minority Issues can play an important role. Left to themselves, the powerful governments responsible for the steering of divided societies towards a new constitutional future tend to draw on superficial notions of ancient hatreds and to echo communal stereotypes. As a result, they advocate carve-ups of power by the ethnic protagonists, making reconciliation an ever-receding horizon, as in Bosnia, or prematurely recognise as legitimate actors non-state forces which have pursued campaigns of violence, creating a climate of moral hazard, as in Kosovo. In either case, polarisation becomes the path-dependent course on which that society is perhaps irremediably set. In Belfast, for instance, the longest of the scores of so-called peace walls dividing Catholics and Protestants has been heightened twice, and no one can ever foresee it coming down. It is therefore crucial that independent intellectuals such as those involved in ECMI present more informed evidence and more progressive policy prescriptions so that a path from division to reconciliation in which the self includes the other can realistically be charted.
Thanks. That's a very good line for conclusion, that it's not only about top-down initiatives, which are of course very, very important, but also bottom-up initiatives, strengthening of civil society, strengthening of these links on a level of individual people, and of course with the decisive role of decision makers indeed, but not through simplified understanding of interethnic relations. So thank you very much for your time and for inspiring talk. It's a really pity that with conversation with experts, we are limited to about half an hour. I think I would have much more to ask you and to discuss. I look forward to collaborating with you in the future, and it's really, maybe we have another round of talks sometime next year when we know more also about these councils in Serbia, but some other places in Europe. So really many thanks for your willingness to participate in this conversation, but also with such inspiring message and also information about Intercultural Cities Programme. To our viewers, thank you for your interest, and please follow us on our website and social media channels. All the best and cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ljubica.